Jonathan sat at his desk, staring blankly at the glowing screen before him. The late hour painted the city skyline with a palette of deep blues and scattered amber lights. Yet, no matter how many hours he spent in his office surrounded by the steady hum of machinery and the muted chatter of his team, a sense of emptiness clung to him. It had been 2 years since Caroline's accident, a tragedy so sudden and jarring that it turned every moment of silence into a reminder of what he had lost. His career, once a relentless pursuit of success, had become a refuge where he could drown the noise of grief. Jonathan was a renowned architect, lauded for his vision and precision, but accolades did little to fill the void. The death of Caroline, the love of his life and mother of their daughter Ella, was a fracture that no blueprint could mend. "Jonathan, are you heading home soon?" The voice of his assistant, Neil, snapped him back to the present. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, feeling the wear of sleepless nights etched in the lines near his eyes. "Yeah, I think so. Thanks for checking in," he replied, offering a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Neil nodded, the unspoken understanding between them palpable, and quietly left the office. Jonathan finally gathered his things, his mind drifting to home, now a place that felt foreign. Waiting there was Margot, a bright and charming woman who had entered his life a year after Caroline's death. She had brought warmth back into his world, a laughter that echoed in the hallways, and a nurturing presence for Ella. Still, Ella never warmed to her fully. There was a reluctance, a silent hesitation that kept the girl at arm's length. The ride back to the townhouse was cloaked in a heavy silence. The streets of Boston whispered with the distant hum of traffic, a city alive yet detached. When Jonathan entered the house, the smell of chamomile and the soft glow of the hallway lamp greeted him. He paused for a moment, listening. The muffled sound of Margot reading a bedtime story floated down the corridor. Jonathan walked toward Ella's room, peering in through the half-open door. Margot's voice was lilting, confident as she spun the tale of brave knights and wild adventures. But Ella's eyes were far away, fixed on a spot past Margot, lost in thoughts Jonathan wished he could reach. "Hey, sweetie," he said softly, stepping inside. Ella's gaze snapped to him, a flicker of relief crossing her small face. She sat up, pushing the blanket aside. Margot's smile faltered for just an instant before she turned to Jonathan, her eyes dancing with practiced warmth. "You're home early," she said with a touch of surprise. "Yeah, wanted to catch Ella before she fell asleep," he said, ruffling his daughter's hair. Ella leaned into his touch, a rare moment of closeness that made Jonathan's heart ache. "Good night, Dad," she whispered. Her voice carried a note of something he couldn't name but felt deeply. He glanced at Margot, whose expression was inscrutable. "Good night, Ella," Margot said, standing up and placing the book on the bedside table. As they stepped out, she lingered in the hallway, watching Jonathan with a smile that felt as polished as the house itself. "Everything okay?" she asked, reaching for his arm. Jonathan nodded, though the unease that came over him said otherwise. He glanced back at Ella's room before meeting Margot's eyes. "Yeah, just tired," he said, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw a shadow cross her face, gone as quickly as it came. The morning light seeped through the cracks of the drawn curtains, casting long, thin rays across the room that reached the edge of the bed where Jonathan sat. His eyes were fixed on the floor, where a small toy knight, left by Ella, lay on its side. The house was quiet, save for the muffled ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the distant clatter from the kitchen. Margot's humming, light and cheerful, drifted from downstairs, accompanied by the rhythmic clang of pots. The sound should have brought a sense of comfort, but it didn't. It sat awkwardly in the space between memory and reality. Jonathan rubbed his temples, pushing away thoughts that clung to him like morning fog. A sudden knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Ella, still in her pajamas, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit with one arm. Her hair was a mess of curls, her eyes wide and searching. Jonathan managed to smile. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than intended. Ella didn't smile back. She shifted from one foot to the other, the fur of her rabbit trailing along the floor. "Is Margot making pancakes again?" she asked, eyes darting toward the staircase behind her. The question was simple, but the way she said it, low and hesitant, made Jonathan pause. "Yeah, I think so. Want me to go down with you?" He stood, the creak of the old floorboards breaking the silence. Ella nodded, gripping her toy a little tighter. As they descended the stairs, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon met them, filling the air with a sweetness that felt out of place. Margot stood at the counter, wearing an apron with flour dusted across the front. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing a face that was bright and full of energy. She turned as they entered the kitchen, her eyes lighting up. "Good morning, my two sleepyheads," she chimed, placing a spatula down with a theatrical flourish. Jonathan caught the slight tension in Ella's posture as she watched Margot's movements carefully, like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Morning," Jonathan said, forcing himself to match Margot's energy. He glanced at Ella, who stayed a step behind him, only moving forward when he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Margot's smile faltered momentarily as her gaze flicked to Ella before returning to Jonathan. "Made your favorite, pancakes with blueberries," Margot announced, turning to flip the last pancake in the pan. "And guess what? We have fresh orange juice today." Ella climbed into her seat at the kitchen table, the rabbit placed neatly on her lap as if it were sharing the chair. She watched in silence as Margot plated the pancakes and set them down with a flourish. The vibrant stack sat steaming, blueberries glistening like tiny jewels. Jonathan pulled out the chair next to Ella and sat, catching the subtle way she shifted closer to him. "Thank you, Margot," he said, offering her a smile as she took her seat across from them. The kitchen, with its warm wooden cabinets and checkered tiles, suddenly felt smaller. There was something suffocating in the quiet that followed. "You're welcome," Margot replied, taking a sip of her juice. Her eyes never left Ella, who poked at her pancakes without eating. Jonathan noticed, but before he could say anything, Margot leaned forward slightly. "Did you have fun with your friends at the playground yesterday?" she asked Ella, her voice just a touch too smooth. Ella's fork froze mid-air. She nodded, but kept her gaze on the table. "That's good. I saw you playing with Sarah and her brother. They seem nice," Margot continued, a smile spreading across her face. Jonathan's eyes shifted between them, the discomfort in the room more palpable than ever. Ella looked up then, her expression guarded. "Yeah," she said, the single word hanging in the air like an echo. Jonathan felt an urge to break the tension, but Margot beat him to it. "You know," she said, a lightness returning to her tone, "we could go back today, maybe bring a picnic. Wouldn't that be fun?" The suggestion was met with silence. Ella's small hands gripped her rabbit, the white of her knuckles stark against the plush fabric. "Maybe not today," Jonathan said finally, trying to keep his voice even. Margot's eyes met his, and for a second, they darkened before she quickly masked it with a laugh. "Of course. Another day then," she said, taking another sip of juice. The quiet that followed was interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. After breakfast, Jonathan excused himself, heading to the study to sort through some papers. The room, lined with books and scattered blueprints, was his sanctuary, a place where logic ruled and emotions were tucked away. But today, even this space offered no refuge. He couldn't shake the scene at the table, the subtle way Ella recoiled at Margot's voice, the hesitation in her answers. There had always been a disconnect between them. Margot had been patient at first, trying to bridge the gap with outings and gifts. But Jonathan noticed the way she would watch Ella when she thought no one was looking, her eyes sharp and calculating, not quite fitting the warmth she projected. A knock at the door startled him again. He looked up to see Margot, framed by the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. Jonathan nodded, leaning back in his chair as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, more out of reflex than genuine curiosity. Margot smiled, but it was tight, almost forced. "I wanted to talk about Ella," she said, folding her arms. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He nodded for her to continue. "I've been trying, Jonathan. Really, I have. But she still treats me like I'm a stranger," Margot said, her eyes searching his face for some sign of agreement. I want to know if I'm doing something wrong." The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, taking in the way her eyes shimmered with something he couldn't quite read. Regret? Frustration? He wasn't sure. It takes time, he said finally. Ella's been through a lot.
We both have.
Margot looked away, nodding slowly, the tension in her posture loosening but not disappearing. When she turned back, her smile was back, though thinner now. I know, she said. I just hope she sees that I care. Jonathan nodded, offering her a faint smile. But as Margot left the room, closing the door softly behind her, the knot in his chest only tightened. From the hallway, he could hear the soft murmur of Ella's voice, talking to her rabbit as if it were her only confidant. The afternoon sun painted golden patches across the living room floor, and Jonathan could hear the faint rustle of the wind against the windows. He sat on the edge of the sofa, one foot tapping nervously. Ella was upstairs, her voice drifting down as she hummed a tune while coloring. It was a rare sound, one that used to be so common when Caroline was alive. The thought brought a tightness to Jonathan's chest that he quickly pushed away. Margot was in the kitchen, the sound of running water and clinking dishes creating a steady, almost monotonous backdrop. The house felt suspended between moments, caught between past and present, comfort and unease. Jonathan stood, stretching to relieve the tension in his shoulders, when the sound of footsteps on the staircase drew his attention. Ella appeared, her small frame silhouetted by the light streaming in from the window at the top of the stairs. She hesitated when she saw him watching, but then walked over, holding out a piece of paper. "Daddy, look," she said softly, her voice steady but guarded. Jonathan took the drawing, eyes softening as he examined it. It was a picture of a castle, with tall, pointed turrets and a moat filled with little blue scribbles for water. A lone knight stood on the drawbridge, facing a golden sun that looked almost hopeful. "Did you draw this all by yourself?" he asked, bending down to meet her eyes. Ella nodded, a tiny smile appearing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, it's for you," she said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Jonathan's heart swelled, a warmth spreading through him as he looked at her. Before he could respond, the quiet of the room was broken by Margot's voice calling from the kitchen. "Ella, could you help me set the table for lunch?" The girl's smile faded as quickly as it had come. Her gaze dropped, and she stepped back from Jonathan, the distance between them suddenly more than physical. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Jonathan said, giving her a reassuring nod. Ella turned, clutching the stuffed rabbit to her chest as she disappeared around the corner. Jonathan watched her go, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. He wanted to say something, to reach out and bridge whatever gap had opened between his daughter and the life they were trying to rebuild. But words felt inadequate, as if any attempt would crumble like dry leaves before it could even touch the core of the problem. Lunch was set with the usual care Margot put into everything she did. Perfectly folded napkins, plates arranged just so. She moved around the table with a practiced ease, glancing occasionally at Ella, who fumbled with the silverware, her small hands struggling to place each piece neatly. "Thank you, Ella," Margot said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. It was a tone Jonathan had come to recognize, one that made his jaw clench even when he didn't know why. He took his seat, noticing how Ella's eyes stayed focused on her plate, the rabbit now placed on the chair beside her like a silent sentinel. They ate in near silence, the clinking of cutlery punctuating the quiet. Jonathan tried to make conversation, mentioning a project at work and asking Ella about her art. Her answers were brief, careful. It wasn't until Margot spoke again that the tension in the room shifted. "Ella, I heard from your teacher that there's a special art show next month," Margot said, sipping her water. "Wouldn't it be nice to submit one of your drawings? Maybe even the castle you just made." Ella's fork paused midair. She looked up at Margot, eyes wide with surprise that quickly morphed into something Jonathan recognized. Fear. I don't know," Ella stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nonsense," Margot said, setting down her glass. "You're very talented. Everyone should see what you can do." Jonathan felt the room shift, an almost imperceptible tightening in Ella's posture. He opened his mouth to interject, to ease the pressure, but Margot's gaze pinned him in place. It was subtle, But there, a silent challenge masked by a smile. "It's up to Ella," Jonathan said finally, his voice calm but firm. Margot's eyes flicked to him, a brief shadow crossing her face before she turned back to her meal. "Of course," she said, the brightness in her tone feeling sharper than before. Ella visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping as she returned her attention to her plate. After lunch, Ella retreated to her room, and Jonathan stood at the sink, rinsing his plate. Margot appeared at his side, her movements as smooth as ever. She reached for a towel, dabbing at her hands. "She needs encouragement, Jonathan," Margot said, her voice soft but laced with something else, an insistence that left little room for disagreement. "She's too withdrawn." "It's not healthy," Jonathan sighed, placing the dish in the drying rack. "She's adjusting in her own way, Margot. We have to let her do it at her own pace." Margot's eyes met his, searching for something he couldn't name. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, almost conspiratorial. "I just want her to be happy. You know that, right?" "I do," he said, but the words felt hollow. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that her intentions were pure. But that doubt, the one that whispered when he saw the way she watched Ella, clung to him like smoke. The rest of the day passed in a blur of half-hearted chores and moments that felt rehearsed. It wasn't until the sun began to set, bathing the house in the deep orange of dusk, that Jonathan heard Ella's voice again. She was at the bottom of the stairs, the rabbit still in her arms. "Daddy," she said, and the tremble in her voice made him turn immediately. "Can we go to the park? Just us?" Jonathan glanced at Margot, who was in the living room, pretending not to listen but whose eyes held a glimmer of something he couldn't ignore. She met his gaze, one eyebrow raised as if to say, "What will you do?" "Of course, sweetheart," Jonathan said, forcing himself to hold Margot's stare for a moment longer before looking back at Ella. Her face lit up with a smile so small it could be missed, but it was real, and that was enough. As they left, Jonathan felt Margot's eyes on them, sharp and unyielding, like a presence that wouldn't let them forget she was there. Jonathan's study, usually his refuge from the chaos of life, now felt like the walls were pressing in on him. The faint glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across blueprints and scattered notes. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes unfocused as he stared at the sketches. The quiet of the evening pressed down heavily, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. The park trip with Ella had been brief but precious, filled with moments that reminded Jonathan of who she was before everything changed. She had clung to his hand the entire time, her laughter hesitant but genuine when a group of ducks waddled past them, searching for breadcrumbs. He had asked her about school, about her drawings, anything to keep the conversation alive. Ella answered carefully, eyes darting to check if anyone else was listening, as if Margot's presence still loomed in the space around them. A soft knock at the study door pulled him back to the present. Jonathan's heart sank slightly, anticipating Margot. But when he called out, it was Ella who peeked in, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly. Her small face was partially obscured by the glow from the hallway, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "Daddy, can I stay here with you for a while?" she asked, her voice as fragile as the paper she used for her art. Jonathan felt a rush of relief mixed with sadness. He nodded, motioning for her to come in. "Of course, sweetheart. Come here," he said, pushing aside a stack of papers to make room for her on the oversized chair by his desk. Ella climbed up, tucking her legs beneath her as she nestled into the seat, her rabbit sitting upright in her lap like a guard on duty. Jonathan watched her, the shadows of worry playing on her small features. He didn't push her to speak. He knew that sometimes silence was the safest place for a child who carried unspoken fears. They sat like that for a while, the only sounds the faint rustling of papers and the occasional creak of the house settling. Jonathan returned to reviewing his notes, his eyes skimming the lines but not absorbing the information. He stole glances at Ella, who seemed content just being close to him. It reminded him of when Caroline was alive, how their evenings would often end with the three of them curled up in the living room, the quiet filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the warmth of being together. But that warmth had been replaced with something colder since Margot entered their lives. Jonathan wanted to trust her. She had been supportive when they first met, a comforting figure who seemed to understand his grief. But over time, small inconsistencies had started to chip away at that trust. The subtle ways she insisted on taking charge, how her gaze lingered on Ella, the whispers of concern he couldn't quite silence. "Daddy?" Ella's voice broke the silence again, soft and hesitant. He looked at her, heart heavy. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy would have liked Margot?" The question hit him like a blow, unexpected and sharp. Jonathan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to answer simply, to offer her an easy truth, but he couldn't lie to her. "I think your mom would have wanted us both to be happy," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. Ella nodded, looking down at her rabbit as if seeking comfort in its unblinking eyes. "She doesn't like my drawings," Ella said suddenly, her voice so low it was almost lost to the room. Jonathan's brow furrowed, leaning forward to catch her eyes. "Margot doesn't?" he asked, though he already felt he knew the answer. Ella shook her head, her curls brushing her cheeks. "She says I should draw other things. Not castles. Not knights," she whispered. Jonathan's chest tightened, a wave of anger and sadness rolling through him. Ella's drawings had always been a window to her dreams, filled with stories of bravery and safe havens. Why would anyone try to take that from her? Before he could say anything more, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Jonathan stiffened, a reflexive response that only deepened his resolve. The door creaked open, and Margot stood there, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice light but carrying an undertone Jonathan didn't like. "It's late, Ella. You should be in bed." Ella's eyes darted to Jonathan, wide and anxious. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness rise within him. He stood, placing a gentle hand on Ella's back. "I was just about to take her up," he said, his tone firm. Margot's eyes flickered, a smile playing at the corners of her lips but not reaching her eyes. "All right," she said, drawing out the word. "Good night, then." "Good night," Jonathan echoed, watching as Margot lingered for a moment longer before turning and disappearing down the hall. He exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Ella slipped off the chair. The rabbit clutched tighter as she stepped toward the door. "Come on, sweetheart. I'll tuck you in," he said, and together they walked to her room. The hallway felt darker, the house larger and more echoing than before. In her room, the walls were lined with drawings, castles, dragons, and heroes standing proudly. Jonathan sat at the edge of her bed, smoothing the blanket over her as she settled in. Her small hand reached out to grasp his, and he felt the weight of her trust, fragile but unwavering. "Everything's going to be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. Ella's eyes closed slowly, but not before she whispered one last thing. "Promise." Jonathan's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Promise." As he stood and walked to the door, leaving it ajar so the light from the hallway could stream in, he caught sight of Margot down the corridor. She was watching, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. He stepped out and closed the door gently behind him, the weight of unspoken fears pressing in as he walked back to the study, determined to find out what lay behind the shadows that now seemed to stalk their home. The days crept forward with a strange, unsettling rhythm. Jonathan found himself caught between the routines that held his life together and the small, disquieting signs that chipped away at his sense of normalcy. The tension between Margot and Ella had settled like an invisible fog over the house. It lingered in the corners, palpable yet unspoken. One night, after a particularly long day at the office, Jonathan returned home to find the living room dimly lit. The only source of light came from a single lamp that cast a soft, golden glow over the room's edges. Margot sat curled in an armchair, a glass of wine in her hand and a distant look in her eyes. She turned as he entered, the edges of her smile taut. "Long day?" she asked, swirling the liquid in her glass absently. Jonathan nodded, shrugging off his coat and draping it over the back of the sofa. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," he said, walking past her to the kitchen where the faint scent of lemon and basil still lingered from dinner. He grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out into the darkened yard where the branches of the old oak tree swayed gently. Margot appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the kitchen lights. She studied him for a moment, the silence stretching thin. "You've seemed distant lately," she said, her voice balanced between concern and accusation. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he set the glass down with a dull thud. "Just work. And things at home," he added, glancing toward the hallway where Ella's room lay shrouded in quiet. Margot's expression shifted, a hint of something crossing her face too quickly for him to read. "Things at home," she echoed, stepping forward. "Is this about Ella?" Jonathan felt a surge of defensiveness, but forced it down. He needed to be careful with his words, not just for Ella's sake, but for whatever fragile piece still held their household together. "She's been more reserved than usual," he said, turning to face Margot fully. "I think she's struggling." Margot's eyes narrowed, though her smile stayed. It was that kind of smile that made Jonathan's skin prickle, practiced and too perfect. "She'll come around, Jonathan. It's just a phase. All children have them," she said, dismissing the topic with a flick of her wrist. "Maybe," he conceded, though his tone held an edge of doubt that didn't escape her notice. For a moment, an uncomfortable silence enveloped them, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Are you questioning how I am with her?" Margot asked suddenly, her eyes locking onto his with a sharpness that made him pause. The question hung between them, daring him to answer. "No," Jonathan said after a beat, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. Margot's smile widened a fraction, and she stepped back, her glass still in hand. "Good. Because I love her, Jonathan. I love both of you," she said, turning away before he could respond. The words echoed in his ears as she disappeared up the stairs, leaving him alone in the kitchen with the weight of questions he was too afraid to confront. Later that night, Jonathan sat in his study, the only light coming from the desk lamp that cast a narrow beam across the room. Papers and blueprints lay scattered, but his focus was elsewhere. He had begun digging into Margot's past in subtle ways, initially out of a need for reassurance. But what he found unsettled him. Margot had a charm that seemed to draw people in effortlessly, but behind that charm were inconsistencies. Places she said she had lived but didn't appear in any records, stories that shifted slightly each time she told them. He was jolted out of his thoughts by the creak of the floorboards. His heart jumped as he turned to see Ella standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. She clutched her rabbit close, her small frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. "Daddy, I can't sleep," she whispered. Jonathan's worry deepened at the tremor in her voice. He stood and crossed the room, kneeling down to be level with her. "Did you have a bad dream?" he asked, brushing a stray curl from her face. Ella nodded, but there was more there, something that clung to her expression like a shadow. "She was in my room," she said, so quietly he almost didn't catch it. Jonathan's stomach dropped. "Margot?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Ella nodded again, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "She said she needed to check on me, but she just stood there," Ella continued, her voice barely audible. Jonathan's heart raced as anger and confusion tangled in his chest. He forced a smile, hiding the worry that gnawed at him. "Come here," he said, scooping her up in his arms. "You can sleep in my room tonight." Ella rested her head on his shoulder, her body tense but grateful. As he carried her down the hall, Jonathan's eyes flicked to the closed door of their bedroom, behind which Margot slept, or pretended to. He pushed the thought aside as he settled Ella into his bed, tucking her in and sitting beside her until her breathing evened out and she drifted into sleep. With the room cloaked in darkness, Jonathan stared at the ceiling, his mind refusing to rest. The house was quiet, but it felt like a silence that waited for something to break it. The light from the street lamp outside painted thin, eerie stripes across the walls, and he listened to the faint creaks of the house, each one amplifying the knot in his chest. Margot's earlier words echoed in his mind. "I love both of you." He wanted to believe it, wanted to convince himself that her intentions were genuine. But the doubt, sharpened by Ella's fear and the whispers of uncertainty, refused to fade. Jonathan knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening beneath the surface, he would have to face it. For Ella, for Caroline's memory, and for whatever thin thread of trust he still held onto, he needed answers. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Jonathan resolved to find them, no matter what secrets lay waiting to be uncovered. Jonathan woke with a start, the faint gray light of early morning filtering through the curtains. The house was quiet, but his pulse thudded with the memory of Ella's whispered words from the night before. She said she needed to check on me, but she just stood there. It played over and over in his mind as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The weight of his daughter's fear gnawed at him, and he knew he could no longer dismiss the tension that had been building since Margot entered their lives. He turned his head to see Ella still curled up beside him, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her small face, relaxed in sleep, looked peaceful, but Jonathan's heart clenched with the realization that she had felt unsafe in her own room. A room that once held laughter and bedtime stories was now shrouded in something unspoken. Careful not to wake her, Jonathan slipped out of bed and padded across the cool wooden floor. He closed the bedroom door behind him, pausing to listen for any sign of movement from Margot. The hallway was silent, the house still. Downstairs, he brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma cutting through the haze of fatigue that hung over him. He stood by the window, looking out at the yard where the grass was damp with dew and the branches of the old oak tree moved gently in the morning breeze. The stillness outside was at odds with the storm of doubt inside him. Footsteps on the stairs jolted him from his thoughts. Margot appeared, wrapped in a silk robe that shimmered faintly in the soft light. She offered him a smile, her hair perfectly in place, as if she hadn't just woken up but had been waiting for this moment. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth that made his skin prickle. Jonathan nodded, sipping his coffee as if the heat could burn away the unease. "Morning," he replied, eyes not quite meeting hers. Margot glanced around the kitchen, her eyes lingering on the empty chair where Ella usually sat. "Did Ella have trouble sleeping again?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jonathan set his mug down, the weight of her question pressing against him. "Yeah," he said, keeping his tone even. "She said she had a bad dream." Margot's lips parted, a shadow of something. Concern? Annoyance? Crossing her face before she spoke. "Poor thing. She's been restless lately, hasn't she?" Jonathan forced a nod, watching her carefully. "Yeah, she has." The silence that followed was thick, filled with words unsaid. Margot turned away, busying herself with the cupboard. Jonathan watched her back, noting the way her movements seemed deliberate, controlled. The ease she once had seemed strained, a performance slipping at the edges. "I'll go check on her," she said after a moment, reaching for a glass. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "Let her sleep," he said, the words coming out sharper than intended. Margot paused, her hand frozen mid-reach. When she turned to look at him, her smile was gone, replaced by an expression he couldn't quite place. "Of course," she said, her tone soft but her eyes searching his face. "You're right." Jonathan didn't reply. He took another sip of his coffee, the warmth no longer comforting. He felt her gaze linger on him for a moment longer before she turned back to the counter, moving with the same measured grace that now seemed almost threatening. The rest of the morning passed in strained quiet. Ella woke up just as the sun reached its full height in the sky, her eyes bleary but relieved when she saw her father still there. He ruffled her hair and kissed her forehead, the small gesture of reassurance as much for him as it was for her. "I was thinking we could go to the library today," he said, watching as her face lit up at the suggestion. The library had always been their shared haven, a place where stories and silence coexisted in a way that felt safe. Ella nodded, hugging her rabbit tighter. "Can we get more books about castles?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Of course," Jonathan said, his heart warming at the sight of her smile. It was a fleeting moment of normalcy, one he held on to as they got ready to leave. Margot appeared as they were putting on their coats, her eyes darting between them. "Where are you going?" she asked, the casual tone not quite hiding the tension beneath. "The library," Jonathan said, not waiting for approval. Margot's eyes narrowed for the briefest moment before she nodded. "All right, be safe," she said, though there was something in her voice that made Jonathan's skin prickle again. The drive to the library was filled with quiet conversation, Ella's voice growing more animated as she talked about the stories she wanted to read. Jonathan listened, a smile breaking through his worry. When they arrived, the familiar smell of old books and polished wood greeted them, wrapping them in a cocoon of calm. Jonathan watched as Ella darted to the children's section, her eyes scanning the shelves with excitement. He followed, running his fingers over the spines of books, but his mind drifted. He needed to find out more about Margot, what she was hiding, what truths lay behind the stories she told so effortlessly. A sudden voice pulled him back to the present. "Excuse me, are you Jonathan Miller?" Jonathan turned to see an older man, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. The man's expression was one of recognition, though Jonathan couldn't place him. "Yes, that's me," Jonathan said, a cautious edge to his voice. The man nodded, glancing at Ella, who was too absorbed in her search to notice. "I'm Dr. Thompson," the man said, his voice low. "I knew Caroline, and I think I know Margot too." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The air seemed to thicken around him, the library's quiet now a drumbeat of silence. "She used to come by the clinic a few years back. Before Caroline's accident," Dr. Thompson continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his next words. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the questions he had been afraid to ask now loomed, waiting to be answered. Jonathan stood frozen, the hum of the library falling away until all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. Dr. Thompson's eyes held a mixture of urgency and discomfort, as if he hadn't expected to bring up the past in such an abrupt way. Jonathan's mind raced, caught between the weight of the revelation and the quiet voice of his daughter a few feet away, softly humming to herself as she flipped through picture books. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. The words were heavy in his mouth, the question unspoken but clear. Why would Margot have been at a clinic connected to Caroline? Dr. Thompson glanced at Ella, then back at Jonathan, reading the tension in the father's face. He nodded slightly, indicating a row of quieter tables tucked away at the back of the library. "Do you have a moment to talk somewhere more private?" Jonathan looked at Ella, who was still absorbed in her books, unaware of the undercurrent of dread that now filled the air. "Ella, sweetheart," he called softly, "I'm going to be right over there, okay? Stay where I can see you." She nodded, her eyes still on the page as she turned it with care. Jonathan followed Dr. Thompson to the secluded area, the creak of the wooden floor underfoot sounding louder than usual. They sat at a small table near a window that overlooked the park across the street. Sunlight spilled in, warm but stark, as if exposing the conversation they were about to have. "I know this is sudden, and I'm sorry for that," Dr. Thompson began, his voice measured and low. "But when I saw you, I couldn't ignore it. Margot, I remember her from a few years ago. She came in under a different name back then, Maria Thompson. She claimed to be related to my wife's family, which, as it turned out, wasn't true." Jonathan's stomach twisted. The pieces that hadn't quite made sense before, the vague details in Margot's stories, the way she avoided discussing certain aspects of her past, now felt like red flags he should have seen more clearly. "What did she want?" he asked, barely recognizing his own voice. "She was asking questions about patients, specifically those dealing with high-stress trauma. I didn't think much of it at first. She mentioned having a sister in distress, someone who needed help but was afraid to come in," Dr. Thompson said, pausing as if the memory was a sour taste in his mouth. "But now, seeing her name connected with yours, I'm concerned. Caroline was one of my patients, Jonathan." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. The idea of Caroline and Margot being linked in any way beyond his own grief was unthinkable. Jonathan clenched his fists under the table to steady himself. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he managed. "I retired shortly after Caroline's death," Dr. Thompson admitted, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "I didn't piece it together until much later when I read about your engagement. And by then, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence." Jonathan's mind reeled as he tried to absorb this. Every interaction with Margot, Every carefully crafted smile and reassuring word now seemed shrouded in something darker. Did she ever mention Caroline directly? No, Dr. Thompson said, leaning back and exhaling slowly. But the way she pried about certain details, especially regarding trauma and coping mechanisms, it always felt more personal than she let on. A sudden noise, a child's laughter from another corner of the library, cut through the tension like a blade. Jonathan turned instinctively toward the sound, eyes finding Ella, who was now watching him with a faint, curious frown. He forced a smile, raising a hand to reassure her. Dr. Thompson's expression softened as he noticed the exchange. I don't know what's going on, Jonathan, but I felt it was important you knew. People like Margot, they can be very good at hiding their true selves. Jonathan's jaw tightened, the implications sending a chill down his spine. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. Thank you, he said, his voice tight. I need to go. With a nod, Dr. Thompson stood as well, his eyes filled with a sympathy that only deepened Jonathan's dread. If you ever need more information or help, reach out. Take care of that little girl. She's more perceptive than you might think. Jonathan's throat closed up as he turned and walked back to Ella, who was now watching him with wide eyes. He forced another smile as he knelt beside her. Ready to go, sweetheart? He asked, his voice softer now, almost breaking. Ella nodded, slipping her book into her small backpack. She reached for his hand, and the simple trust in that gesture nearly undid him. The drive home was silent, the only sound the low hum of the car and the occasional rustle as Ella shifted in her seat. Jonathan's mind spun, piecing together fragments of conversations, glances, moments that now felt loaded with hidden meaning. The way Margot had insisted on certain activities for Ella, the subtle control she seemed to exert, and the look she gave when she thought no one was watching. It all clicked into place, forming a picture Jonathan didn't want to see but could no longer ignore. When they arrived home, Margot was waiting in the living room, a magazine open on her lap, her face lighting up when she saw them. The sight made Jonathan's skin crawl, but he schooled his features, masking the storm beneath. Hey, how was the library? She asked, her tone warm, inviting. Ella walked past her with a small wave, heading to her room without a word. Jonathan watched Margot's eyes flicker with something, confusion, then irritation, before she turned her attention back to him. It was fine, he said, his voice even but cold. Margot tilted her head, studying him. You look tired, she noted, a smile tugging at her lips as she stood and walked toward him. The way she approached, the way her eyes searched his face, felt like an assessment. Long day, Jonathan said, stepping past her and into the kitchen, needing the distance. The sound of the front door shutting behind him as Ella left the room felt like a breath he didn't know he was holding. Margot followed, leaning against the doorway, watching him. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice carrying that subtle insistence that had always unnerved him. For a moment, Jonathan considered playing along, pretending everything was fine. But then he remembered the fear in Ella's voice, the ghost of Caroline's memory that had been stirred by Dr. Thompson's words. I need to know more about your past, he said finally, turning to face her. Margot's smile faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough. Why would you say that? She asked, her tone measured, eyes narrowing slightly. Jonathan felt the air shift, the unspoken tension now laid bare between them. Because, he said, taking a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff, it's time for some honesty. The silence that followed Jonathan's words was profound, an echo that seemed to ripple through the air, bending time. Margot's eyes, which had always been windows to carefully controlled emotions, narrowed slightly as if recalibrating. Her fingers, which gripped the edge of the doorway, whitened momentarily before she let out a small, calculated laugh. Honesty? She repeated, tilting her head. The smile that flickered on her lips didn't reach her eyes. Where is this coming from? Jonathan didn't look away, his resolve hardening with every heartbeat. I spoke to someone who knew Caroline, someone who also remembered you, he said, watching for her reaction. For a split second, Margot's composure cracked. The corners of her eyes tightened before she smoothed them over, a mask slipping back into place. She took a step forward, folding her arms as if for protection. "Jonathan, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice level but the undercurrent of tension unmistakable. "Yes, you do," he countered, stepping closer, the space between them charged with unspoken questions. "Dr. Thompson, he said you visited his clinic. You used a different name, Margot. Why?" The question sat between them, sharp and undeniable. Jonathan could see her mind working, her gaze darting as if searching for an exit. When she spoke, it was with a steadiness that seemed rehearsed. "I don't owe you an explanation for every chapter of my life, Jonathan," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to defiant. "We all have pasts." Jonathan felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest. He ran a hand over his face, trying to maintain control. "This isn't just about a past you didn't mention. This is about Caroline. About Ella. You say you love her, but she's afraid of you. I see it. Margot. Don't pretend it isn't there." Margot's eyes darkened, and the warmth she so carefully projected seemed to drain away. For the first time, Jonathan saw her for what she truly was, a collection of shifting parts held together by force of will. "She needs structure, Jonathan," Margot said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You let her drift, lost in stories and drawings. She needs reality. And yes, maybe I'm harder on her than you like, but I am trying to prepare her for a world that doesn't coddle." "That's not your job," Jonathan snapped, the anger he had kept at bay breaking through. "It's not your place to decide what she needs." Margot stepped back, the change in her expression sudden and sharp. "And whose job is it, then?" "Yours," she shot back. "You bury yourself in your work, chasing ghosts. You think I don't see how you stare at her, seeing Caroline's shadow in every move she makes? You think that's enough?" The words hit him like a blow. He stared at her, stunned, the room spinning with accusations unspoken for far too long. A tense silence settled over them, heavy and suffocating. Margot took a deep breath, seeming to catch herself, her hands dropping to her sides. "I have done everything to keep this family together," she said, her voice a brittle edge. "To give Ella a mother. To give you a partner who can shoulder the grief you refuse to let go of." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "I didn't ask for that," he said, his voice low but firm. "I never asked you to replace her." The room fell silent again, both of them staring at each other across the chasm that had opened wider than ever. Footsteps on the stairs made them both turn. Ella stood there, half hidden behind the banister, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The sight of her small frame, so fragile against the backdrop of their argument, made Jonathan's chest ache. "Ella," he said, softening his tone, "it's okay. Go back to your room." But Ella didn't move. She glanced from her father to Margot, her grip on the banister tightening. Margot's expression shifted, the cold veneer cracking as she took a step toward the girl. "I'm sorry if we scared you, sweetheart," Margot said, her voice shifting to a soothing coo. But Ella shrank back, her small hands trembling. Jonathan moved before he thought, positioning himself between them. "I think you should leave the room, Margot," he said, his voice even but unyielding. Margot's eyes flared with something that looked like disbelief, then anger. "Are you serious?" she whispered, glancing between him and Ella. "You're really choosing this distance over what we could have?" "I'm choosing my daughter," Jonathan said, meeting her gaze without flinching. For a moment, Margot looked as if she might argue, her chest rising and falling with the effort to contain herself. But then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, the click of her heels sharp against the floorboards. The sound of the front door opening and closing reverberated through the house, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Jonathan turned to Ella, who stood frozen on the stairs, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his own heart cracking under the weight of the moment. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to take her hand. She hesitated, then let go of the banister and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The warmth of her small body, the trust she showed by holding onto him so tightly, felt like both a comfort and a reminder of what he needed to protect. He didn't know what Margot's connection to Caroline really was, or why she had inserted herself into their lives with such precision. But as he held Ella, Jonathan vowed that he would find out. Whatever shadows had crept into their home, he would face them head-on. The sky outside darkened, the quiet of the evening settling back into place. But the peace felt false, a fragile veneer over the storm that had yet to break. Jonathan stood in the cool, dim light of early evening, his body taut with tension as he watched the police assemble around Margot's house. Each officer moved with quiet precision, their murmurs and hand signals casting a weighty silence over the scene. Jonathan's heart pounded as he saw Margot appear in the doorway, her figure sharp against the fading daylight. Her eyes darted from left to right, assessing the situation with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She was cornered. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had nowhere left to hide. Margot's eyes caught Jonathan's, and her face twisted into an expression he could only describe as venomous. The woman he had once known, who he had once trusted, was now nothing more than a dangerous stranger. He held her gaze, refusing to be the first to look away, wanting her to understand that he was no longer the man she could deceive and manipulate. Margot took a step forward, her body tense as though calculating a last-ditch escape. Jonathan stepped toward her, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "Margot," he called, his tone a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "It's over. You don't have anywhere left to go." She stopped, a flicker of desperation flashing across her face. For a brief, vulnerable moment, Jonathan thought she might break down, might confess, might finally reveal the truth about Caroline. But in an instant, her expression hardened, a steely glint taking over her eyes as she held his gaze defiantly. She lifted her chin, defiance etched into every line of her face, even as an officer stepped forward to clasp her wrists in handcuffs. She didn't struggle, didn't say a word, but her eyes remained fixed on Jonathan with a fury so intense he felt it hit him like a physical blow. As the officers led her toward the waiting police van, she finally broke her silence, her voice cutting through the cold evening air like a knife. "Do you really think you've won?" she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You have no idea why I did what I did, do you?" "None at all." Jonathan's stomach churned, but he kept his composure, taking a measured breath to keep his own anger in check. "Then tell me, Margot," he replied steadily. "Why did Caroline have to die? What was so important that you'd destroy so many lives?" At the mention of Caroline's name, Margot's face twisted with a strange mixture of pain and anger. For a fleeting moment, her mask slipped, and Jonathan caught a glimpse of something deeper, something almost vulnerable. "Caroline," she repeated, her voice softening as if she were speaking to herself. "She was perfect, wasn't she? The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect everything. And you loved her like I was never even there." Her voice grew bitter. "You only noticed me when she was gone. I did this for you, Jonathan. For us." He felt his stomach twist in revulsion as he looked at her, a hollow emptiness settling over him. "For us?" he repeated, barely able to comprehend the depths of her self-delusion. "You destroyed my family. You used Ella. You tried to rewrite my life into some twisted version of your own making." Margot's expression faltered, and for a moment, she looked almost wounded. "Ella," she murmured, as though only now realizing the pain she had inflicted on his daughter. She hesitated, but her face quickly hardened, masking whatever regret might have been there. "Ella was collateral damage," she said, her voice cold. "She needed to understand that life isn't a fairy tale. She needed to see reality, to understand what love really looks like." At that, Jonathan felt a wave of fury so intense he had to grip his hands into fists to keep himself steady. He opened his mouth to say more, to somehow put into words the rage and heartbreak he felt, but one of the officers stepped forward, signaling it was time to move Margot to the van. She gave him one last look over her shoulder, her expression one of fury and loss. As the van door closed, Jonathan felt a strange emptiness settle over him, a feeling he hadn't anticipated. He thought there would be relief or even some form of justice, but instead, he was left with a profound sadness. All of Margot's lies, all of her manipulations, were now exposed. The woman he had once loved and trusted had unraveled, revealing a darkness so deep he couldn't bear to look at it. But, perhaps more than anything, he felt a weight lift from his chest, a slow realization that this was, finally, an end to the torment Margot had caused. He walked away from the scene, his mind heavy, each step measured and deliberate. He felt like a man emerging from a storm, dazed and raw. His thoughts drifted to Ella, the daughter who had suffered so much without understanding why. She had been caught in the middle, torn between her father and the woman she had come to trust, the woman who had betrayed her innocence. As he walked through the empty streets toward home, Jonathan found himself thinking of Caroline. She had been his anchor, his guide through every storm, and now, as he faced the aftermath of Margot's treachery, he clung to her memory as a lifeline. He pictured her laughter, her gentle smile, the way she had always made their home a place of warmth and love. It felt like a distant memory now, but one he was determined to keep alive for Ella. He wanted his daughter to remember Caroline not through the haze of grief and loss, but as the mother who had loved her unconditionally. When he finally returned home, the house felt quiet and still. Ella was waiting for him in the living room, curled up on the couch with one of her favorite books. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. He walked over and sat beside her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Dad," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it over?" "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's over." They sat together in silence, the weight of the past few months settling over them like a heavy blanket. Ella's small hand found his, and she squeezed it tightly, as if anchoring herself to the reality that, finally, they were free from Margot's grip. Jonathan felt a swell of resolve build within him. He would rebuild their life, piece by piece, creating a new chapter for them both. One that honored Caroline's memory, free from the shadows of deception that had clouded their world. Later that evening, as Jonathan tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older, wiser, touched by the pain they had endured together. "Will things go back to normal now?" she asked, her voice laced with hope and uncertainty. Jonathan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Things won't be exactly the same, Ella, but we'll make new memories, new happy moments, just like the ones we had with your mom. It will take time, but we'll find our way." Ella nodded, her gaze softening as she lay back against her pillow. For the first time in months, Jonathan saw a flicker of peace on her face, a lightness that had been missing for so long. As he closed her door softly, Jonathan felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But beneath the weariness, there was a glimmer of hope. He understood that healing would be a gradual process, one that required patience and resilience. But he was ready to move forward, to help Ella find her way back to a life untainted by fear and betrayal. That night, as he lay in his own bed, sleep came slowly, his mind turning over the events of the day, the culmination of all the lies and deceptions Margot had spun. But beneath the lingering pain, there was a steady, quiet certainty. He and Ella would heal. They would rebuild their lives together, honoring Caroline's memory while moving forward, one day at a time. And finally, the long nightmare of Margot's twisted game was over. In the days that followed Margot's arrest, the quietness felt surreal to Jonathan. The house, once suffused with tension and secrets, now echoed with an unfamiliar stillness. But for Jonathan, this silence felt like a balm. He and Ella, though still navigating the complexities of their recent ordeal, were beginning to settle into a fragile new peace. He watched Ella closely as she drifted through their home, her young face etched with emotions far too heavy for her age. Though Margot was gone, her presence lingered, woven into the fabric of Ella's memories and fears. Jonathan knew he would need to guide his daughter through a tangled web of confusion, anger, and sadness. But he was ready. On a drizzly Saturday morning, Jonathan found Ella by the large bay window in their living room, watching raindrops race down the glass. She had always loved the rain. It was something she and Caroline used to share, spending hours just watching the storm clouds gather and then scatter in the breeze. Now, though, she seemed distant, almost haunted, her small figure silhouetted against the gray light. "Ella," Jonathan began softly, coming to sit beside her. She didn't turn, but he could see her eyes reflect the shifting light outside, distant and thoughtful. "Do you want to talk about everything that's happened?" For a moment, she remained silent. Then, her voice, small but resolute, broke the quiet. "I don't understand, Dad. I don't understand why Margot did all those things." Jonathan sighed, struggling to find the words. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 1,000 times since Margot's arrest. But now, sitting here beside his daughter, he felt each phrase falter before it could leave his mouth. "Sometimes, Ella," he said slowly, "people do terrible things because they're lost. They convince themselves that hurting others will somehow make their own pain go away. But that's not true. It never is." Ella's gaze shifted from the rain to him, her eyes wide and questioning. "Did Margot hate us?" "No, I don't think she did," Jonathan replied honestly, trying to understand it himself. "But she didn't know how to love either. Not in the way that's real and safe." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "She tried to make us into something we weren't. And when that didn't work, she tried to force it. But love doesn't work like that." Ella's fingers tightened around the edge of her dress, her knuckles pale. "I thought she was going to be like Mom," she whispered, the rawness in her voice breaking Jonathan's heart. "I thought. Maybe she was here because Mom couldn't be." Jonathan felt tears sting his eyes. He reached out and took her small hand, squeezing it gently. "No one could ever replace your mom, Ella. Caroline was. She was one of a kind." He paused, letting the words settle. "But you don't have to worry about that anymore. We're safe. You're safe." The assurance seemed to soothe her, if only a little. Ella leaned into his embrace, her small form relaxing against him. He felt the weight of her head against his shoulder, and in that moment, he promised himself he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to question her safety again. Days turned into weeks, and the darkness that had clouded their home slowly began to lift. Jonathan started taking Ella to the places she used to love before Margot had entered their lives. They visited the beach Caroline had adored, its sweeping sands stretching beneath the open sky, the waves lapping against their ankles as they laughed and talked freely for the first time in what felt like forever. The fresh air, the freedom. It was the beginning of healing. One warm afternoon, Jonathan and Ella decided to sort through Caroline's belongings. The task had loomed over Jonathan since her passing, but now, with Ella by his side, it felt right. They opened boxes of old letters, photographs, and tokens of the life they had once shared as a family. The familiar scent of Caroline's favorite lavender perfume seemed to drift from the boxes, wrapping them in the comforting memory of her presence. Ella held up a photograph, her fingers tracing Caroline's smiling face. "She was so happy here, wasn't she, Dad?" Jonathan nodded, his own heart heavy but grateful. "Yes, she was. Your mom loved every moment she had with you." They spent hours this way, laughing and reminiscing, finding joy even in the bittersweet memories. For Jonathan, it felt like he was finally reclaiming something precious, something Margot's shadow had obscured for too long. But their journey wasn't without its challenges. Ella's teachers reported that she often grew quiet during class, her attention drifting. At home, she would sometimes wake from nightmares, her small hands trembling as Jonathan held her close, whispering reassurances. In those moments, he understood how deeply the ordeal had affected her, how much Margot's betrayal had shaken her sense of trust. But he stayed patient, giving her space to heal at her own pace, letting her know he was always there. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set, Ella looked up at him with a clarity that both surprised and moved him. "Will you ever marry someone else, Dad?" Jonathan's breath caught. He hadn't anticipated the question, and for a moment, he struggled to find the right response. "I don't know, Ella," he replied honestly. "Right now, my only focus is you, and making sure you're happy and safe." Ella nodded thoughtfully, a small smile playing at her lips. "I think Mom would like that." In the quiet that followed, Jonathan realized that, in some ways, They were both learning how to rebuild, to trust again. Together, they were finding their way forward, step by cautious step, unburdened by the shadows of the past. Months later, on a chilly autumn afternoon, Jonathan took Ella to a park nestled in the heart of the city. They strolled among the fiery hues of the trees, the crisp leaves crunching beneath their feet. There was a sense of closure in the air, a finality that felt both comforting and bittersweet. As they walked, he told her stories of Caroline, memories he had kept close to his heart, things he hoped would remind Ella of the mother she'd lost. And as they sat on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, Jonathan looked at his daughter, seeing not the fragile child Margot had tried to manipulate, but a resilient young girl who had faced and overcome more than most adults ever would. He felt an overwhelming pride, a fierce love, and he knew that they were going to be okay. "We're going to be all right, aren't we, Dad?" Ella asked, as if reading his thoughts. Jonathan pulled her close, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine." As they sat there, the wind stirring the fallen leaves around them, Jonathan felt the last remnants of Margot's influence fade away. In its place, there was hope. Hope for a future where he and Ella could live freely, shaped not by loss but by the love that Caroline had left behind. That night, as he tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at him, her eyes clear and bright, and whispered, "I love you, Dad." Jonathan felt his heart swell. "I love you too, Ella. Always." He turned off the light and closed the door softly, a quiet smile on his face. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jonathan knew that they were finally, truly safe. And as he lay in bed, listening to the gentle hum of the house settling around him, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. A peace that promised a new beginning, a life unshadowed, a future full of light.